Welcome, everyone. My name is Will Marion. I'm the co-founder of the Positive Group. I'm joined today by two of my colleagues. I have Dr. Eloise Crush, who heads our Insights team. Good afternoon, Elle.
Hi there.
And we've got Dr. Brian Marion, the other co-founder of the Positive Group. Good afternoon, Brian.
Hi.
Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the subject of social connection, and really focusing in on what's the role of social connection to our psychological health and well-being. I think 2020 has been has made this such a relevant concept within psychological circles in particular, because we've seen this big increase in some challenges around loneliness, around anxiety, around depression. And I think a lot of this has been driven by this redefining of how we interact and socialize with those around us. And we're obviously still in the midst of that. So I suppose what we're really keen to do today is to really break down why social connection seems to be so important to our psychological health, and then look at what is it that we can actually practically do about it. Brian, should we start with why does social connection matter so much, and why is it important in the context of psychological health?
Yeah, I think the evolutionary biologists and the anthropologists argue that the carbon dating suggests that we became hunter-gatherers about 1.5 million years ago. And we formed into very tight, cohesive social groups. And this is Dunbar's work from Oxford that looks at the size of those groups. They're normally about 150 to 200. But this all ended a bit with the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago. The first city was only built 8,000 years ago. And now in the UK, 85% of us live in cities. So I think the message here is that a lot of our neurobiology, a lot of our factory settings were designed for the savannah, not for the city. And I think that's relevant to how we function today. But what's been shown with lots and lots and lots of work is that inclusion, being part of a group, is being accepted and being valued within a group, whether that's a family, community, or at work, has extraordinary protective impact. It has a neurobiological impact. It protects your mood, it improves your immune function, it improves your longevity. There is a wealth of data showing that social support, it buffers you against stress. And I think that's because it links to survival. If you're part of the group, there's safety in numbers and there's strength in numbers. Being excluded from the group, and we talked about this in the last podcast, well, Ellen, you did with Tim, if you're excluded from the group or you're lonely, that has an amazingly deleterious impact on mental health, physical health, and longevity. And I think this is a sort of missing bit of the jigsaw. Because medicine and psychiatry and psychology tend to be reductionist, we need to be looking outside of the human, the old saying, no man is an island. So we need to be looking at how we connect with others. So I think social emotions, and there's lots of social emotions from embarrassment to guilt to shame. These emotions were designed to keep us in the group. And if we were in the group, we were better off. But what evolution has also supplied us with is this extraordinary capacity of what's called social Wi-Fi, this ability to read other people's emotions or try and understand what other people's intentions are. Now, in a social group, this is really important. So is this person trustworthy? Are they a threat? Can I approach them or should I avoid them? And in a social group, that's really important. So we're very good at reading how other people are feeling. And then that impacts on how we feel. And this goes through one of the fastest neural circuits in your brain. It goes midbrain to midbrain. It goes through what Daniel Kahneman called your system one. It primes you. This person is dodgy. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you think, I don't like this person. This is a fantastic safety behavior to keep you safe in a group. And I think what's fascinating about that is that it happens so quickly. So what we know is that social support is protective. Lack of social support is pretty corrosive and damaging to us as human beings.
So I mean, it's interesting what Tim was talking about last time, is that, you know, the more isolated we get, or the less connection we get, the more those interactions become judged as well. So it becomes harder to then connect. And I think that's possibly something that we're seeing, is that, you know, with the uncertainty going up, those lack of sort of almost normal interactions happening. That's possibly increasing our vigilance to threat. And that's, I mean, would you suggest that's why we're seeing, you know, this increase in those statistics around loneliness, you know, around anxiety and depression going up by a third, possibly doubling. I mean, this has got to be linked to the way that we're interacting and connecting in this sort of new environment.
I think definitely. I think the social distancing, human beings are social animals. We get huge nourishment. And I want to emphasize this concept of nourishment. And if you look at the study on the Romanian orphanages under Ceausescu, these little children were growing up. They had their nappies changed. They were fed, but they didn't receive emotional nourishment or social succor from other human beings in the same way as normal children would hope to experience. And the interesting thing is that the data shows their brains are different. Babies are wiring up about 1 million neurons per second. And actually, the more nourishment contact they get, it nourishes them. And they actually fail to thrive if they don't get emotional nourishment. And I think this is really, really key, because those babies' brains are about 10% smaller than other babies that were adopted but received emotional support and nourishment. So even taking a group that were adopted, they actually had 10% less brain capacity. Their physical growth isn't the same. And that continues into adulthood, sadly.
So that's so I mean, it's presumably most important at that developmental stage. So that's one question. But also, what are there examples that we've seen where in adulthood and within communities and groups where we've seen you know, how social connection actually plays out as a protective factor?
Yeah, I think there's masses and masses of data showing that social support is protective, but a couple of examples would be the armed forces. There's very good data now showing that the best protection against developing mental health problems, but also PTSD in the armed forces, is the quality, or the perceived quality. And I want to emphasize that, because it's a bit like your loneliness podcast. It's the perceived support. If you think people have got your back, if you think people are there for you, that is incredibly protective to our health. And it reduces the risk of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, there's nothing as good as social support for reducing that. And another nice study is Robin Dunbar's work at Oxford, where he looked at the boating crew. When they train on their own, their pain threshold goes up to a certain level. And these guys can put up with a lot of pain. But when they're with their fellow oarsmen, the team members, their pain threshold doubles. Now, I think what Elle's going to share with us soon is how social support can reduce stress, but it can also increase your pain threshold. These are neurobiological changes. And I think it's something that we've ignored as a really important part of human well-being, but also health and longevity.
Absolutely, I think that performance factor is so important as well, isn't it? It's not just about health and well-being. This is actually a key performance factor, is how we connect and collaborate and integrate with those around us. Elle, it'd be good to consider this in the workplace, because we obviously spend a huge amount of our adult lives in the workplace. And I know you and the Insights team have been looking at some of the data over the last couple of months around this, and particularly looking at that relationship between how we connect our psychological health, but particularly linked into leadership and cultural factors. Can you share some data around that with us?
Yeah, definitely. Just bring
You can get the slides up.
So we've been collecting data during the pandemic. So because at Positive, we do a lot of work with individuals working in professional and educational settings. And what we're keen to understand is we have a lot of data around, there's a lot of data in general around the importance of social support outside of the workplace. So what tends to happen is you look at levels of perceived support from friends, family, and significant others. And this is called the multidimensional scale of social support. But what we've tried to do is try and understand how much does support within the workplace impact upon employees' psychological health and well-being. And this first bar graph just shows some of the sort of high-level findings. So when so these are the bars sort of split out by well-being groups. You've got the low well-being group and the higher well-being group. And actually, oops, sorry.
Can you enlarge the?
Yeah, is that better?
I think you can probably make it even bigger, can't you? Full screen? Maybe not.
Yeah, hang on.
Top right hand.
Sorry, everyone. This is a Zoom disaster.
Top right hand corner.
You know you're in trouble when Brian's giving you technical advice.
I do. But yeah, I think I'll leave it. If I click back onto, if I just leave it on this one for now. I think it's not helped by the fact I've got two screens.
Yeah.
So we've got a yeah. So essentially what we find is those who report higher levels of well-being report significantly higher levels of support from their colleagues, from their managers, and from their senior leadership teams. And what's really interesting about this is, so each of these individual levels of support were all found to be associated with higher well-being. So when you just see high levels of support from colleagues, you see individuals reporting high well-being, and similarly for managers and senior leadership. And what was really interesting is we see this consistency of levels of social support across groups. So when you see individuals reporting high levels of support from their colleagues, you also see high levels of support from managers and leaders. So, and equally, when people are reporting lower levels of support from colleagues or managers, they also report lower levels of support from leaders. So you start to see that you can sort of cluster the data because of that. So if you've got individuals working in environments where they have low levels of support from their peers, from their managers and leaders, we call this a low support environment. Whereas if they have really high levels of support from their colleagues, managers and leaders, we have this high support environment. And the reason we believe there might be this consistency around levels of support that people receive is, or perceive that they have internally within their organisation, is likely to relate to the fact that we have sort of behaviours that are role modelled within organisations. So if you see really high levels of support from leadership, and leaders are being supportive towards those who report into them and towards each other, and then managers are supportive towards each other and to their staff, you start to see this influence in social norms. And so it's highly likely this is a key explanation as to why you sort of see these supportive behaviours kind of cascading through organisations. And as a result of that, you can see how you can develop these sort of low support, medium support, or high support environments, where these sort of shared behaviours, shared supportive behaviours are either present or not present. And so linked to that, we've got these, what we wanted to show was how these different levels of support internally can be associated with different outcomes for staff. So if you've got high levels of support across within teams, you've got high support from managers and high support from leadership. What differences does that make to individuals' psychological health or performance outcomes? And what we find is individuals who work in these high support environments are significantly more likely to report higher levels of well-being, which you'd expect to see, particularly after that, sharing that initial slide.
Now, just back to those colleagues, line managers, senior leadership. is it showing any one of those to be particularly powerful in this, or are they quite equal?
Yeah, so interestingly, support from they all found to be fairly similar. So you look at these are all significant associations that we're reporting, and what you can do when you have an association between something like a colleague, line manager, or senior leadership support with well-being, you can look at the individual effect sizes of each of those relationships, and that's ultimately just explaining the strength of each association. You see very similar effect sizes, but they're all robustly associated. Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, we've had a question on the chat box saying, what's the sample size and the p-values? Can you?
Yeah, so we've got, so this is about 700 people, and I only accept a significant association if it's under 0.05, so which is kind of the standard level of significance, but a lot of these associations are significant to 0.001, which is very good basically for those not into p-values. And then just quickly onto another key finding. So what we found was in terms of these different support environments, so again, where we've got lots of supportive behaviours at all levels, people report within those organisations being significantly less distracted. And so the reason this kind of makes sense is because when we experience really high levels of anxiety or low mood or negative thinking and worry, that can really distract us, and these internal disruptions can influence our focus and ability to concentrate. So it's quite interesting when people feel they're in these supportive, safe environments, actually they report less issues with being distracted.
I think this is so relevant to so many of the conversations we're having, because I think one of the big challenges we see is that, you know, is people managing their energy and their time when working virtually, and also boundarying their day and making sure they've got that time to recharge. So I think constantly seeing this link between that ability and you know, psychological health, and then the environment that you work in is really interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then I'll just share a couple more findings. So we also see people reporting they're more optimistic when they work in these high support environments compared to low support environments. And finally, we asked something that we're really interested in. So obviously people's perceived levels of social support are a kind of way of accessing levels of connection. So if you perceive that you're supported, we know that that's really important for psychological health. So this is an area that psychologists are really focused on. And then in terms of people feeling a sense of belonging, this is also a really fundamental aspect to human connection. And I think it's really nice actually that a lot of organisations we work with are really focused on trying to build improved belonging. And we had this question in our survey, which was to ask people, so how has the pandemic impacted upon your sense of belonging to your organisation? And so again, so there's lots of people that report no change, but we were quite interested in the people that had reported a negative impact. So their belonging has kind of decreased since the pandemic, or their the impact is positive, which means their belonging has increased. And what we found was, so those who report working in a low support environment, actually around 50% of those individuals who have felt a lack of support since the pandemic have suggested that their belonging has reduced. So it's had a negative impact on their sense of belonging. Whereas interestingly, almost a third of individuals who work in high support cultures report an increased sense of belonging since the pandemic, which is pretty amazing, to be honest, given these kind of sort of physical distances between everyone and the strange disrupted working practices. So we were really interested by that, and we wanted to share that because it's kind of another interesting measure we have linked to connection during the pandemic. And now I'm going to stop sharing because that hasn't gone particularly well.
Thank you, Elle. That's very good. I think that last data point is fascinating. It just shows the opportunity when you have a high support environment. You know, actually the pandemic has had a positive impact on their sense of belonging to that organization during this period. And also I think that link into that people's levels of optimism, their focus, their productivity, just really emphasizing what a key performance indicator this creating supportive cultures can have. And I suppose it'd be good to just one of the things all of our data shows, and I think this is increased in the pandemic, is the importance of leadership and the role of leadership. I mean, Brian, you talked a lot about sort of evolutionary psychology and that link into social psychology. Hierarchy obviously plays a major part in human psychology. But we're really seeing this play out very powerfully at the moment in terms of health and performance in these businesses. Can you shed some light on why that might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's sort of anthropology and evolutionary biology, really. I think we're slightly different to chimpanzees and silverbacks and the gorillas. I think human beings tend to have a coalition of people at the top of a group, and that coalition then actually influence a great deal of what happens. But I think what happens to people who are not in that leadership group is that you work out who holds the power and the influence. And who holds the power and the influence then creates, for a lot of us, the route to safety. Because if you do what the leadership and the senior people in the coalition are asking you to do, you're more likely to succeed, get promoted, and in a sort of evolutionary point of view, survive. You're more likely to stay in the group. So I think leadership is a very interesting area. And if you look at Milgram's experiments on authority, I think that highlights the power of authority and leadership. And we all know what it's like to be barked at by someone who is senior. I think in terms of social conformity, this is fascinating because I think this links to a wider concept around social norms and cultural display rules. And this links to the tone from the top, if you like, the shadow of the leader. And what's fascinated us as a group, with lots of organizational and clinical psychologists working in organizations, our team working in organizations, is we often find leaders underestimate how influential they are, how important they are. And I think the shadow of the leader, because there's something about what the senior people value, what they encourage, what they respect, and what they expect. And I think historically, there's been a loading, and in medicine, where I trained in, and in psychology, there's a sort of assumption that if you have technical skills, you will also have social skills. And this is what's sometimes called a halo effect. Because you're good at one thing, people assume you're good at another. What I think is fascinating about that is another piece of work that Elle did with her insights team was on a big international law firm, and they shared a lot of data with us. And we also Elle did some very in-depth research with them as well. But we had around 100,000 data points. And this is fascinating because when you did the correlational studies, Elle then did a factor analysis, and 3 big factors came up as predictive of how people performed in the organization. So if the partner in this international law firm treated employees, junior lawyers, with respect and were interested in them as a human being, that was one factor. The second factor was whether they were interested in their professional development, so mentored their career. And the third factor was if they could have honest, open, authentic conversations. If those 3 factors were met, those bits of the organization had higher discretionary effort, greater engagement. They actually had less attrition. They spoke about the organization in a more positive way. But the fascinating thing is they also worked harder, longer hours, and delivered more billable hours, but their stress levels were lower than other areas in the business where those criteria were not met. So I think this is fascinating, because I think if what it's demonstrating is what the other research shows, which is that if you create cohesive, collaborative, supportive groups, this is a key performance indicator, a key quality indicator. And I think it has huge potential for organizations who are going through a really, really tough time at the moment.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing around that perception of workload as well, when you are, I remember that being a factor in that study. The more connected you felt to the leadership, and the team, was actually influenced, not your perception of workload, even if it was higher than other groups. So it's just having such a powerful impact, particularly at the moment. But we're talking a lot about this ability to, we talk a lot about sort of connection and this ability to connect, but it's easier said than done, isn't it? I think this is the challenge around this. So in order for leaders to be able to connect, they need to in and of themselves feel like they can. Can you shed some light on what those what those skills are around that?
Well, I think some of it, not all of it, but some of it is about understanding how you're feeling and how you message. And that old adage that, how you feel inside, you tend to push into the world. And what Daniel Kahneman has shown with his Thinking Fast and Slow is that emotions use system one. They use the fastest neurological circuit in our brain. A lot of our decision making is driven by our emotion, but a lot of our behavior to our fellow man and woman is driven by our emotion. So what I think happens for people when they start to get stressed or wound out is they push that into the world. And there's lots of research, particularly on doctors, teachers, nurses, that the milk of human kindness, and I think this comes back to Elle's point about it hijacks your RAM, it hijacks your working memory, it drives your cognition, your physiology, your behavior. And interestingly, doctors who get stressed, the milk of human kindness curdles. Now, these can be very good doctors, but the way they treat patients and the way they treat colleagues can be diminished by the fact that they get stressed. And I think this is really important, because often we're unaware that we're behaving in a certain way, and we're unaware of our unawareness. And I think that's why emotional literacy, understanding emotion, understanding how you are messaging and how you're coming across, is key. And then that links to developing emotional regulation. Because I think, emotionally intelligent leaders tend to perform much better. They have people skills. And I think it's that group of lawyers who are running high quality teams. But I think it's our state of mind predicts the quality of our relationship. There are other factors, obviously, around where you sit on the spectrum, where how many mirror neurons you have. There are lots of other trait factors that influence it. But the great thing is, and I think this is really exciting, is that this is a neuroplastic process. You can train people to get better and better at developing good communication skills.
Absolutely, and I think this then links neatly into that concept around role modeling, doesn't it? And setting the tone and cultural display rules, which I think have become even more important in terms of how people can manage their psychological health, particularly when their levels of uncertainty are on the increase. That moves us in, I think, to really looking at how we can build better connection, because I think we actually put out an article this week around why psychologists go on about connection, because it is quite a simple concept, but it is actually quite a tricky process. And I think one of the things that we look at Positive are what are the core sort of psychological skills that underpin the ability to connect better. Elle, I know you've been very influential around identifying those skills, and we've built those skills into our curriculum. Can you shed a bit of light on those and how they link through to building better connections?
Yeah, sure. I think the the question about improving connection is it's a massive question, and there's lots to it, which is why no one answers it particularly well in a very quick, concise way. But I think in terms of, if you think about how to improve interactions, so like we're saying that the workplace is really important. So if you think about how to improve interactions and use that as an example, I think there's a positive, we look at it from two perspectives. So there's things linked to the self. So prior to and during a conversation or an interaction, there are things about, so if I'm having a meeting with Brian and I'm stressed because I've just been on a connection webinar and my slides didn't come up, for example, and I might be stressed or worried about something in the future, or I've got a really busy day, and before I go into that room, I'm not in a good headspace, so I'm stressed out and I'm not in a good place to interact. If you've got good awareness and a good, say, emotional regulation, so I can calm myself down after something's not gone well, or I can really sort of focus my attention and regulate my attention. These sort of self-regulation skills are really helpful, because both before I go into a conversation and during it, I can regulate my sort of emotions and attention and thoughts and things. And I think that's one of the reasons why we teach these skills up front prior to our connection module, because there's lots of foundational skills that are necessary prior to interacting with others. Not sort of prior to, but sort of prior to trying to build those in addition. And then I think there's more these interpersonal skills, which are things like active listening, perspective taking, empathy, compassion. So skills we all have foundational sort of knowledge and understanding of, but perhaps some of us, a lot of us can improve on where we are. So until I joined Positive, I thought I was quite good at listening. And then you hear Sinead and Brian talk about active listening, you start to realise perhaps you're not as good as you thought you were. And I think that awareness piece is key, and the fact that none of us need to be concerned about where our skill sets are or how good we think we are at things. It's the idea that we can improve on where we are. So yeah, so I think there's that sort of self piece, and there's the interpersonal piece, which I think is useful to differentiate between.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we were to pick a couple of skills just to delve into, I mean, Brian, you touched on and as of you, El, self-awareness, and what we push out into the world and the impact that's going to have on those around us is huge. But I think the other interesting one, I think, is attentional regulation is such an important one, particularly when we're connecting in a virtual world, because I think the messages we pick up are very different, and if we're unable to be present, particularly in those interactions, particularly on one-to-one interactions, and particularly I think over Zoom or virtual platforms, can exacerbate this. Brian, any thoughts on that emotional regulation and attentional regulation and specific skills that are very relevant right now?
Yeah, I think that emotion links to attentional focus, partly because your mood state will drive what you pay attention to. So if I'm angry, I tend to focus on things that irritate me. If I'm feeling anxious, I see myself as vulnerable, the world is dangerous, the future is uncertain. So I scan the world for threat. The problem is some of these cognitive styles then maintain our levels of anxiety. I think on attentional focus, I think this is really key. I mean, it's estimated because system 2, your working memory and your attentional focus are so small relative to our cognitive capacity. You get something like 11 million bits of data into your brainstem per second, but you can only process about 50 bits of data per second. You can only hold 4 bits of data for 90 seconds. So our attentional focus is tiny relative to the cognitive capacity of our brain. And most of our knowledge and wisdom is held in system 1, and then we access it when it gets prompted. I think this is really important, because the greatest gift you can offer another human being is your attention. The problem is if you're stressed, anxious, pissed off, worried, angry, most of your bandwidth is being hijacked by your anger and your frustration or your fear, and you have no bandwidth left. And that's why when doctors get stressed, they treat patients badly. And that's why the patients make more complaints, their colleagues make more complaints. this is a real quality indicator of how we communicate. So I think, as Elle was saying, I think that emotional regulation, it's not the only factor, but my goodness, it's an important one.
And on that attentional focus, I mean, it's ironic, isn't it, that psychological health problems tend to make you more self-focused, don't they? So it becomes even harder to relate to other human beings, particularly those in your team. So there's a bit of a sort of double challenge here, isn't there?
It's a miserable, actually, it's a genuinely miserable paradox. It's what sometimes called a positive feedback loop, because the more distressed you become as a human being, the more you avoid and withdraw from the things that can nourish you, because you don't have the bandwidth to do them. So, the way you think when you're distressed actually makes you more distressed. The physical symptoms are uncomfortable. It's an aversive place to be. And then the way you behave to your fellow man and woman can actually undermine your relationships. So it pushes you even further down that slippery slope. And I think working out how to break those circuits is the key issue.
Yeah. And I think we're delving into the area of building skills in that space. But I think just taking those two areas, things that we can do in this sort of virtual world is, around that emotional regulation, is to check in with ourselves before we interact with others. Actually think about, where's your mood state, but also make sure that you're able to be present when you're connecting and interacting with others. And I think, one of the challenges of doing this on technology is there's so many things that can grab your attention. I think we've all been on Zoom calls where people aren't paying attention, and it has that, back to your brain coupling piece, Brian. It's sort of, the social Wi-Fi really plays out quite clearly. I think those are obviously two key skills when it comes to improving levels of social connection. I'm just aware of time. I suppose, just in terms of, just to sum up then, what I'm hearing is that social connection is the most important factor around psychological health. There's nothing that comes close to it. It's also not optional, because we constantly impacting on those around us, and it's the most important thing from cradle to grave. And I think some of those clear examples around how that's playing out within groups in the army, groups of RERS, etc., is really showing the impact of that. From Elle's point, I think this fact that we spend so much time, so much of our lives in the workplace means that we really got to concentrate on that in terms of improving our psychological health. So it's that combination of social support and the workplace is where the opportunity sits around really shifting the needle on psychological health. And it has that added benefit of being a really key performance indicator, which Elle's shown through those productivity levels of optimism, focus, etc. We're also disproportionately impacted by leadership and people in our hierarchy. So I think that understanding and awareness from leadership that they are going to have not on everyone, but they're going to have a significantly higher impact on others is really important. But there's also things we can do about it. Proactively, we can shift the needle on this. But I know we can go on about this, but it isn't as simple as it looks. It might be a simple concept, but it's certainly not a simple process. And I think what we need to look at doing is investing in those skills that can really create tangible difference in the way that we connect and the way that we interact. Any final thoughts from you, Brian or Elle, on that?
I suppose I'd just say that I would suggest that if you're going to distill what we've talked about, it would be that these social skills link back to trust. Trust is built on communication. It's the quality of our relationships. I think this concept that you cannot not communicate, and sometimes you're not aware of how you're communicating, so that's key. But I think trust is the currency of cohesion. It's the currency of social glue. And if you have cohesion and social glue, you create psychological safety. And I think people can then flourish. And I think it's that old African proverb that says, you know, trust arrives on foot and leaves on horseback. It's difficult to build and it requires time and effort, but actually you then have to nourish it. And I think organizations that actually get that right are going to find the difficulties and vicissitudes of life a lot easier to manage.
Almost get that onto a bumper sticker, I'd say, but thank you.
And I'm not going to add anything after that because that was excellent.
Look, if anyone wants to if anyone wants to find out more about how we support organisations around those psychological skills, particularly the Positive Leaders Programme, do get in touch. Also, if anyone wants to understand more around our insights and some of the data that we can look at within your organisation around those individual and cultural factors which are determining health and performance, again, do get in touch with us. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Elle. We'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.